The end of World War II in 1945 marked a turning point in global history. After 6 long years of conflict, the world was eager to heal and rebuild. Cities lay in ruins, economies were shattered, and millions of lives had been lost. But amid the devastation, there was hope. A hope for a future free from the horrors of war. The conclusion of the war brought with it a profound sense of relief, but also the realization that the world had forever changed. As nations began to recover, the global order was reshaped in ways that would define the modern era. New international institutions were formed, political alliances shifted, and countries that had been colonized for centuries began to seek their independence. The impact of World War II was felt in every corner of the globe, and its legacy continues to influence the world we live in today. The creation of the United Nations symbolized a renewed commitment to peace and cooperation, offering a forum for diplomacy and conflict resolution that would seek to prevent future wars. At the same time, the Cold War began to take shape, with the United States and the Soviet Union emerging as the world's 2 superpowers, locked in an ideological struggle that would dominate global politics for decades. But beyond the political and military shifts, the war also left its mark on technology, society, and culture. Advances in medicine, communication, and transportation were accelerated by the demands of war, and many of these innovations found their way into civilian life in the post-war years. The roles of women and minorities in society began to evolve as a result of their contributions to the war effort, leading to social changes that would continue to unfold in the decades to come. As we journey through this story, we will explore the many ways in which World War II changed the world. From the rebuilding of Europe under the Marshall Plan to the decolonization movements in Asia and Africa and the rise of new political ideologies, we will reflect on how this pivotal moment in history set the stage for the modern world. As we delve into this story, let it be a peaceful reflection of the resilience of humanity and the enduring hope for a better future. Chapter 1: The United Nations and a New Era of Diplomacy. As the final battles of World War II came to an end in 1945, the world stood at a crossroads. The devastation had been overwhelming. Tens of millions of lives lost, entire cities reduced to rubble, and economies around the globe in shambles. The horrors of the Holocaust, the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by atomic bombs, and the widespread suffering had left a scar on humanity that would never be forgotten. Yet, amid the sorrow and grief, there was a collective desire to build something better. A world where future generations would not have to endure the same horrors of war. In response to this desire, world leaders came together with a shared vision of peace. They recognized that the international system that had existed before the war had failed. The League of Nations, established after World War I, had not been able to prevent the rise of fascism, militarism, and totalitarian regimes that ultimately led to the outbreak of World War II. The failure of the League of Nations was seen as a cautionary tale, a reminder that maintaining peace required more than just good intentions. It required a new framework for international cooperation, one that would involve all nations in a collective effort to prevent future conflicts. Thus, in 1945, the United Nations was born. The idea of the United Nations had been discussed during the war by leaders such as Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, who recognized that global peace would depend on international cooperation. The United Nations was to be more than just a forum for debate. It would have real authority to intervene in international disputes, promote peace, and uphold the principles of human rights and justice. The United Nations Charter, signed on June 26, 1945 in San Francisco, represented a moment of unprecedented global unity. Representatives from 50 countries gathered to sign the document, which set out the core principles of the new organization. These principles included the commitment to peaceful resolution of conflicts, respect for human rights, and the promotion of social progress. The Charter also outlined the structure of the United Nations, including the creation of the General Assembly, the Security Council, and various specialized agencies designed to address global challenges. The General Assembly was envisioned as a global forum where all member nations would have a voice, regardless of their size or power. Every nation, large or small, had the right to participate in the discussions that would shape the future of international relations. This represented a significant shift from the past, when powerful nations often dictated the terms of international agreements. In the General Assembly, the principles of equality and diplomacy were paramount, fostering a new spirit of cooperation and dialogue among nations. At the heart of the United Nations' efforts to maintain global peace was the Security Council. Unlike the General Assembly, which allowed all nations to debate and pass resolutions, the Security Council had the authority to take decisive action in the face of international crises. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the United States, the Soviet Union, now Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France, were given special responsibilities to safeguard peace and security. These nations, known as the Permanent Five or P5, held veto power over any resolution, ensuring that no major military action could be taken without their consent. This structure reflected the geopolitical realities of the post-war world, as these 5 countries emerged as the dominant powers shaping the new international order. The creation of the United Nations was a radical departure from the isolationist policies that had characterized the interwar years. In the aftermath of World War I, many countries had turned inward, focusing on their own domestic concerns and avoiding entanglement in global affairs. However, World War II made it clear that global problems required global solutions. The devastation caused by modern warfare had erased the notion that conflicts in one part of the world could remain isolated from others. The United Nations, therefore, was not just about preventing war, but about building a system where nations could work together to solve common problems, from poverty and disease to human rights abuses and environmental degradation. One of the most significant early achievements of the United Nations was the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Spearheaded by Eleanor Roosevelt, the Declaration set out the fundamental rights and freedoms that all individuals, regardless of nationality, race, or religion, should enjoy. The Declaration was a direct response to the atrocities committed during the war, particularly the genocide of the Holocaust, and it became a guiding document for the protection of human dignity worldwide. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights continues to serve as the foundation for international human rights law, inspiring movements for justice and equality in countries around the world. In addition to promoting human rights, the United Nations also played a crucial role in maintaining peace through its peacekeeping missions. The concept of peacekeeping was a novel approach to international diplomacy. Instead of relying solely on negotiations to resolve conflicts, the United Nations could deploy international peacekeeping forces to monitor ceasefires, provide humanitarian assistance, and help maintain stability in conflict zones. These forces, often referred to as Blue Helmets, due to their distinctive helmets, were composed of soldiers from multiple countries, representing the collective will of the international community. The first United Nations peacekeeping mission was established in 1948 in the Middle East, where the conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors had erupted following the creation of the State of Israel. The peacekeepers were tasked with monitoring the ceasefire and preventing further hostilities. Since then, United Nations peacekeeping missions have been deployed to conflict zones around the world, from Africa to the Balkans, helping to prevent the escalation of violence and providing vital support to civilians affected by war. The success of the United Nations depended not only on its ability to prevent war, but also on its capacity to address the root causes of conflict. Recognizing that poverty, inequality, and lack of development often fueled instability, the United Nations established a number of specialized agencies to promote social and economic progress. The World Health Organization, WHO, was created to combat diseases and improve health outcomes worldwide, while UNESCO focused on education, science, and culture. Other agencies, such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, provided financial assistance to countries recovering from the war, helping to rebuild economies and promote sustainable development. The formation of the United Nations was a testament to the world's determination to create a lasting peace. While the organization would face many challenges, including the rising tensions of the Cold War, it remained a symbol of hope and unity. The United Nations represented the belief that by working together, nations could achieve more than they could alone. It was a bold experiment in international governance, one that sought to build bridges between nations and foster a sense of global community. Today, the United Nations continues to play a central role in world affairs. It remains a forum for diplomacy, a platform for addressing global challenges, and a symbol of humanity's ongoing quest for peace. From its early beginnings in the aftermath of World War II, the United Nations has evolved into an indispensable institution, one that reflects the enduring hope that, through cooperation and dialogue, the world can achieve a more just and peaceful future. Chapter 2: The Marshall Plan and the Rebuilding of Europe. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Europe lay in ruins. The war had left entire cities devastated, industries destroyed, and millions of people displaced. Economies across the continent were shattered, and the looming threat of famine and social unrest posed serious challenges to the recovery of nations already struggling with the immense toll of the conflict. In this fragile environment, the world faced a pressing question. How could Europe rebuild itself and avoid the mistakes that had led to the rise of fascism, and ultimately another devastating war? The answer came in the form of the Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program. Named after George C. Marshall, the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, the Marshall Plan was an ambitious initiative aimed at rebuilding war-torn Europe, reviving its economies, and preventing the spread of communism, which was gaining traction in the politically and economically destabilized nations of Eastern Europe. The plan was rooted in the belief that economic stability and prosperity were essential to maintaining peace, and it sought to address the root causes of social and political unrest. The origins of the Marshall Plan can be traced back to a speech Marshall gave at Harvard University on June 5, 1947. In his address, Marshall emphasized the dire need for economic assistance to Europe and called for a comprehensive recovery program that would not only rebuild infrastructure, but also revitalize industries and restore confidence in democratic governments. Marshall's speech resonated with leaders across Europe, and within a few months, the framework for the European Recovery Program was developed. The United States, which had emerged from World War II as the world's dominant economic power, committed to providing significant financial aid to Europe. Over the next 4 years, between 1948 and 1952, the United States provided more than $12 billion, equivalent to over $130 billion in today's terms, in financial assistance to European countries, helping them rebuild their economies and infrastructure. The aid came in the form of grants and loans, which were used to fund projects such as the reconstruction of factories, transportation networks, housing, and public services. The program also provided food, fuel, and raw materials to help stabilize economies and prevent further hardship for the people of Europe. The Marshall Plan was unique in that it wasn't simply about providing financial aid. It was about fostering cooperation and collaboration among European nations. The plan encouraged European countries to work together to coordinate their recovery efforts, which laid the foundation for what would later become the European Union. This emphasis on cooperation marked a departure from the nationalism and protectionism that had characterized Europe's pre-war economic policies. By encouraging collaboration, the Marshall Plan helped to create a sense of shared purpose among European nations, setting the stage for the long-term integration of their economies. One of the key objectives of the Marshall Plan was to promote economic stability as a bulwark against the spread of communism. In the years following World War II, the Soviet Union had established control over much of Eastern Europe, installing communist governments in countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. The rise of communism in Eastern Europe posed a direct threat to the political and economic systems of Western Europe, where struggling economies and widespread poverty created fertile ground for communist movements. The Marshall Plan sought to counter this by helping Western European nations rebuild their economies and restore faith in democratic institutions. The Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies were invited to participate in the Marshall Plan, but they refused, seeing the program as an attempt by the United States to exert influence over Europe. Instead, the Soviet Union created its own economic alliance, known as the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, COMECON, to support the reconstruction of the Eastern Bloc. This division between East and West, symbolized by the Marshall Plan in the West and COMECON in the East, marked the beginning of the Cold War, a period of intense geopolitical rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union that would shape global politics for decades to come. The success of the Marshall Plan was remarkable. Within a few years, Western Europe's economy was on the road to recovery. Industrial production surged, unemployment rates fell, and living standards began to improve. By 1952, when the program officially ended, the economies of Western European nations had grown significantly, and many countries had returned to pre-war levels of industrial output. The success of the Marshall Plan was not just measured in economic terms, it also helped to restore political stability to the region. The revival of democratic governments, coupled with the economic prosperity brought by the plan, helped to prevent the spread of communism in Western Europe. One of the long-term impacts of the Marshall Plan was the creation of new institutions for economic cooperation in Europe. In 1951, 6 European nations, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands came together to form the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, which aimed to coordinate the production and trade of coal and steel, two key industries for economic recovery. The ECSC was the first step toward deeper economic integration in Europe, eventually leading to the formation of the European Economic Community, EEC, in 1957, and the modern European Union. Beyond Europe, the Marshall Plan had a profound impact on U.S. foreign policy. It marked the beginning of a new era in which the United States took on a leadership role in global economic and political affairs. The success of the Marshall Plan demonstrated that the United States was willing and able to use its economic power to promote stability and democracy abroad, a policy that would continue throughout the Cold War. The Marshall Plan also helped to solidify the transatlantic alliance between the United States and Western Europe, laying the foundation for institutions such as NATO that would play a crucial role in defending Western Europe against the Soviet threat. While the Marshall Plan is often remembered as an American success story, it was ultimately a joint effort between the United States and the people of Europe. European nations played a key role in the administration and implementation of the plan, and their willingness to work together was critical to its success. The Marshall Plan not only provided financial aid, but also fostered a spirit of collaboration and shared responsibility for Europe's future. The rebuilding of Europe after World War II was one of the most significant achievements of the post-war era. The Marshall Plan helped to lay the foundation for a new, prosperous, and united Europe, one that would eventually become a global economic powerhouse. It also demonstrated the power of international cooperation in addressing global challenges. As Europe recovered, it became clear that the world had entered a new era, one in which nations could work together to achieve common goals and build a better future for all. Chapter 3: Decolonization and the Rise of New Nations. As the dust of World War II settled, it became clear that the conflict had not only reshaped the map of Europe, but had also set the stage for one of the most transformative global movements of the 20th century: decolonization. Before the war, European powers controlled vast colonial empires that spanned Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. These empires had been essential to the economic and political dominance of countries like Britain, France, and the Netherlands. However, the war had weakened these imperial powers, and in the aftermath, the winds of change began to blow across the world, leading to the collapse of empires and the emergence of new nations seeking independence and self-determination. World War II exposed the vulnerabilities of the colonial powers. European countries were left economically drained and militarily weakened by the war, making it increasingly difficult for them to maintain control over their colonies. At the same time, the war had given rise to new ideas about freedom, democracy, and human rights. Ideas that resonated powerfully in the colonies, where millions of people had been subjected to oppressive rule for centuries. The hypocrisy of European nations fighting for freedom and democracy in the war while maintaining colonial dominance was not lost on those living under imperial rule. The rise of independence movements in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East was also fueled by the significant role that many colonies played during the war. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from colonized nations fought for the Allied powers, including troops from India, Algeria, Vietnam, and Nigeria, among many others. These soldiers had fought alongside their European counterparts, and after the war, they returned home with a new sense of pride and determination to achieve independence for their countries. The experience of wartime service also exposed many colonized peoples to ideas about nationalism and self-determination, which would drive the post-war decolonization movement. The first major wave of decolonization began in Asia, where the power vacuum left by Japan's defeat in 1945 prompted nationalist movements to demand independence. In India, the struggle for independence from British rule had been gaining momentum since the early 20th century, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. After years of nonviolent resistance, mass protests, and civil disobedience, India finally achieved independence in 1947, marking the end of over 200 years of British colonial rule. The partition of India into two separate states, India and Pakistan, reflected the deep religious and political divisions that had developed during British rule, but the success of the Indian independence movement inspired other colonies to seek their own path to freedom. At the same time, in Southeast Asia, the defeat of Japan also paved the way for the independence of Vietnam, which had been a French colony before the war. Ho Chi Minh, a nationalist and communist leader, declared Vietnam's independence in 1945, though the French would attempt to reassert control, leading to a prolonged conflict that would eventually become part of the larger Cold War struggle. In Indonesia, nationalist leader Sukarno declared independence from the Netherlands in 1945, leading to a 4-year struggle before the Dutch finally recognized Indonesia's sovereignty in 1949. In the Middle East, the post-war period also saw the dismantling of colonial rule. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked a turning point in the decline of British and French influence in the region. The crisis erupted when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, previously controlled by British and French interests. Britain and France, along with Israel, launched a military intervention, but they were forced to withdraw under pressure from both the United States and the Soviet Union. The Suez Crisis was a humiliating blow to Britain and France and signaled the end of their dominance in the Middle East. In the years that followed, countries like Jordan, Iraq, and Syria gained independence, while Egypt emerged as a leader of the non-aligned movement, advocating for the independence of colonized nations. The process of decolonization in Africa gained momentum in the 1950s and 1960s, as nationalist movements across the continent demanded an end to European colonial rule. Ghana, under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, became the first African nation to achieve independence in 1957, breaking free from British control. Nkrumah's success inspired other African leaders and movements to push for independence, and over the next decade, dozens of African nations followed suit, including Nigeria, Kenya, Congo, and Algeria. The transition to independence was not always peaceful. Many African nations had to wage long and bitter struggles against their colonial rulers, as was the case in Algeria, where the National Liberation Front, FLN, fought a brutal war against the French from 1954 to 1962. Decolonization was not just a political process. It was also a profound cultural and social transformation. As new nations emerged, they sought to reclaim their cultural identities, which had often been suppressed or distorted by colonial rule. Leaders like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Patrice Lumumba in Congo, and Leopold Senghor in Senegal emphasized the importance of African unity, cultural pride, and economic self-reliance. In Asia, leaders such as Sukarno in Indonesia and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam combined nationalist rhetoric with socialist ideas, seeking to create new political and economic systems that would serve the interests of their people rather than the interests of foreign powers. The Cold War had a significant influence on the decolonization process. As the United States and the Soviet Union vied for global influence, newly independent nations often found themselves caught in the middle of this ideological struggle. Both superpowers sought to align newly decolonized nations with their respective blocs. In many cases, this led to conflicts, as external powers provided military and financial support to different factions within these new states. The Korean and Vietnam Wars are prime examples of how decolonization became intertwined with the Cold War, as the global struggle between communism and capitalism played out in regions that had only recently escaped colonial rule. Despite these challenges, the decolonization of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East fundamentally altered the global balance of power. By the late 1960s, the majority of former colonies had gained their independence, and the world map had been redrawn. The emergence of new nations on the world stage reshaped international institutions like the United Nations, where newly independent states played an increasingly prominent role. The shift from a world dominated by European empires to a system of independent nation-states was one of the most profound changes in global history. The impact of decolonization extended beyond the political sphere. The rise of new nations brought with it a new sense of identity, pride, and cultural renaissance in many former colonies. Independence movements sparked a revival of indigenous languages, traditions, and customs that had been suppressed during colonial rule. In literature, art, and music, the post-colonial world saw an outpouring of creativity, as writers, artists, and intellectuals sought to express the struggles, aspirations, and victories of their newly independent societies. Yet, decolonization also left behind many challenges. Newly independent nations faced the difficult task of building stable governments, developing their economies, and addressing the deep social and ethnic divisions that had been exacerbated by colonial rule. In many cases, the arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers led to conflict, as different ethnic and religious groups found themselves in newly formed states without a shared national identity. Civil wars, military coups, and authoritarian regimes became common features of the post-colonial world, as nations grappled with the legacies of colonialism. Despite these obstacles, the process of decolonization was a watershed moment in world history. It marked the end of an era of imperial dominance and the beginning of a new world order, one in which the principles of self-determination, sovereignty, and equality of nations became central to the international system. The rise of new nations transformed global politics, culture, and society, laying the groundwork for a world in which the voices of all peoples, not just those of the great powers, could be heard. Chapter 4: The Beginning of the Cold War. As the world emerged from the devastation of World War II, a new kind of conflict began to take shape, one that would dominate global politics for nearly half a century. This was not a war fought with armies and battlefields, but rather a war of ideologies, power, and influence, the Cold War. At the heart of this conflict were two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, each representing opposing political and economic systems. The Cold War would not only reshape international relations, but also fuel tensions that would impact every corner of the globe. The roots of the Cold War can be traced to the final days of World War II, when the uneasy alliance between the United States, the Soviet Union, and other Allied nations began to unravel. Although the Allied powers had worked together to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, deep ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union had always been present. The United States championed democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union promoted communism and a state-controlled economy. These opposing ideologies, which had been temporarily set aside during the war, quickly resurfaced as soon as the conflict ended. One of the first signs of this emerging rivalry came in the division of Germany. At the end of World War II, Germany was split into 4 occupation zones, controlled by the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. The city of Berlin, located deep within the Soviet-controlled zone of East Germany, was similarly divided. However, it soon became clear that the Soviet Union had no intention of allowing Germany to be reunified under a democratic government. Instead, in 1949, the Soviet Union established the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, a communist state, while the United States and its Western allies formed the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. The division of Germany symbolized the broader division of Europe into 2 hostile blocs, one aligned with the Soviet Union, the other with the United States. This division of Europe became known as the Iron Curtain, a term famously coined by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in a speech in 1946. The Iron Curtain represented not only a physical barrier, but also an ideological divide between East and West. On one side were the Eastern Bloc countries, where communist governments had been installed by the Soviet Union in places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. On the other side were the democracies of Western Europe, supported by the United States through initiatives like the Marshall Plan and the creation of military alliances such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The growing tension between the United States and the Soviet Union soon spilled over into global politics, as both superpowers sought to expand their influence beyond Europe. The Truman Doctrine, announced by U.S. President Harry S. Truman in 1947, formalized the United States' commitment to containing the spread of communism. Truman declared that the United States would provide economic and military assistance to countries threatened by communist insurgencies, beginning with Greece and Turkey. This policy of containment would become the cornerstone of American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, responded by consolidating its control over Eastern Europe and forming its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, in 1955. The Warsaw Pact was a counterbalance to NATO and solidified the division of Europe into 2 opposing military blocs. Meanwhile, the United States and its allies embarked on a strategy of building alliances and supporting anti-communist governments around the world, from Latin America to Southeast Asia. This global competition for influence led to a series of proxy conflicts, where the superpowers backed opposing sides in civil wars, revolutions, and independence movements. One of the earliest flashpoints in the Cold War came in 1948, during the Berlin blockade. In an attempt to force the Western Allies out of Berlin, Stalin ordered the blockade of all land routes into the city, cutting off food and supplies to the Western-controlled sectors of Berlin. In response, the United States and Britain launched the Berlin Airlift, an unprecedented operation in which planes flew around the clock to deliver food, fuel, and medical supplies to the residents of West Berlin. The airlift lasted for nearly a year, and in 1949, Stalin finally lifted the blockade. The success of the Berlin airlift was a significant victory for the Western Allies and solidified the division of Germany into East and West. Another key event in the early Cold War was the Korean War, 1950–1953, the first major military conflict of the Cold War era. After World War II, Korea had been divided into two zones of occupation: a communist North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, and a capitalist South Korea, supported by the United States. In 1950, North Korean forces, with the support of the Soviet Union and China, launched an invasion of South Korea, sparking a brutal war that saw the involvement of United Nations forces, led by the United States. The Korean War ended in a stalemate, with the country remaining divided at the 38th parallel, but it set the tone for future Cold War conflicts, where the superpowers would back opposing sides without engaging in direct combat with one another. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union further heightened tensions. Both nations were determined to develop and stockpile the most advanced and powerful weapons, particularly nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, ending the United States' monopoly on nuclear technology. Over the next decades, both superpowers would amass thousands of nuclear warheads, capable of destroying the world many times over. The threat of mutually assured destruction, MAD, became a defining feature of the Cold War, as both sides recognized that any direct conflict between them could lead to a nuclear apocalypse. The Cold War also had a profound impact on domestic politics in both the United States and the Soviet Union. In the United States, fear of communism led to a period of intense political repression known as the Red Scare. Senator Joseph McCarthy became infamous for his aggressive anti-communist witch hunts, accusing government officials, entertainers, and ordinary citizens of being communist sympathizers. Thousands of people were blacklisted, imprisoned, or lost their jobs during this period, despite little evidence to support the charges against them. The Red Scare highlighted the degree to which the Cold War influenced not only foreign policy, but also the internal dynamics of American society. In the Soviet Union, the Cold War provided a justification for continued authoritarian rule under Stalin and his successors. The Soviet government used the threat of Western imperialism to suppress dissent and maintain tight control over its satellite states in Eastern Europe. Communist regimes in countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia faced uprisings and calls for reform in the 1950s and 1960s. But these movements were brutally crushed by Soviet military intervention. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the Cold War spread beyond Europe and Asia to encompass the entire globe. Both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to gain influence in the newly independent nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, as the Soviet Union attempted to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. mainland. After a tense standoff, the crisis was diffused through diplomacy, but it served as a stark reminder of how close the world had come to catastrophe. The Cold War was not just a military and political struggle, it was also a battle for the hearts and minds of people around the world. The United States promoted its values of democracy, freedom, and capitalism, while the Soviet Union sought to spread its vision of communism and workers' solidarity. This ideological competition played out in cultural exchanges, propaganda campaigns, and scientific achievements, such as the space race, in which the Soviet Union and the United States competed to achieve milestones in space exploration. By the early 1960s, the Cold War had become the defining feature of international relations. The world was divided into two competing blocs, each armed with the most destructive weapons ever created and locked in a struggle for global supremacy. The Cold War would continue for decades, shaping the politics, economics, and cultures of nations around the world. Although the superpowers avoided direct military confrontation, the shadow of nuclear war loomed large, and the competition for influence would fuel conflicts in every region of the globe. Chapter 5: Advances in Technology and Medicine. While the devastation of World War II is often remembered for its destruction, the war also brought about significant advances in technology and medicine that would shape the future of the world in profound ways. The urgency of the war effort spurred innovations across many fields, from weaponry and transportation to medical treatments and communication. These advances, born from necessity, would later transition from the battlefield to civilian life, changing the way people lived, traveled, communicated, and received medical care. In the realm of technology, World War II saw the rapid development of aviation, radar, rocketry, and, perhaps most notably, nuclear technology. The demand for more effective and powerful weapons pushed the limits of scientific knowledge and engineering. One of the most dramatic technological advancements during the war was the development of the atomic bomb, culminating in the Manhattan Project. This top-secret American project resulted in the creation of the first nuclear weapons, which were deployed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, bringing the war with Japan to a sudden and devastating close. The atomic bomb not only changed the course of the war, but also ushered in the nuclear age, fundamentally altering global power dynamics for the remainder of the 20th century. Beyond nuclear weapons, the war accelerated advances in aerospace technology. Aircraft design and production were revolutionized as military forces required planes that were faster, more agile, and capable of carrying heavier payloads. By the end of the war, jet engines had been developed, paving the way for the post-war jet age in civilian aviation. The technological breakthroughs of companies such as Boeing and Lockheed during the war transitioned into the commercial sector, allowing for the rapid expansion of air travel in the 1950s and 1960s. What had once been an extraordinary feat, crossing the Atlantic by air, became routine in the decades following the war, shrinking the world and opening up new possibilities for global travel and commerce. The development of radar was another key technological advancement of the war. Radar, which stands for radio detection and ranging, was initially developed by several nations, including Britain, the United States, and Germany, as a means of detecting enemy aircraft and ships. During the war, radar systems became increasingly sophisticated and played a crucial role in pivotal battles such as the Battle of Britain, where British radar stations gave early warning of incoming German air raids, allowing the Royal Air Force to respond effectively. After the war, radar technology found peacetime applications in air traffic control, meteorology, and even space exploration, helping to revolutionize these fields. Computing technology also advanced significantly during World War II. One of the most famous examples of early computing innovation was the work done at Bletchley Park in Britain, where a team of code breakers, including mathematician Alan Turing, developed machines to decipher the encrypted communications of Nazi Germany. Turing's work on breaking the Enigma code not only contributed to the Allied victory, but also laid the foundation for the development of modern computing. The creation of early programmable machines, such as Colossus, represented the beginning of the digital revolution that would transform global economies and societies in the post-war era. In addition to technological innovations, World War II also brought significant advances in medicine. The war created an urgent need for better treatments for battlefield injuries and infectious diseases, leading to the development of new medical practices and technologies that would save millions of lives in the years to come. One of the most important medical breakthroughs of the war was the mass production of penicillin, the first antibiotic. Discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, penicillin had not been widely available until the United States and Britain ramped up production during the war. The antibiotic's ability to treat bacterial infections, such as gangrene and pneumonia, made it a miracle drug for soldiers, dramatically reducing mortality rates from infected wounds. After the war, penicillin and other antibiotics became widely available to the public, revolutionizing the treatment of infectious diseases and extending life expectancy around the world. The war also advanced the field of trauma medicine and surgery. The sheer scale of injuries sustained on the battlefield pushed doctors to develop new techniques for treating burns, fractures, and amputations. Surgeons working in military hospitals pioneered the use of blood transfusions, skin grafts, and plastic surgery to treat soldiers with life-threatening injuries. Dr. Archibald McIndoe, a British surgeon, became renowned for his work with burned airmen, using groundbreaking reconstructive surgery techniques that would later be used in civilian medicine. The lessons learned from treating war injuries laid the foundation for modern trauma surgery and critical care, transforming the way emergency medicine is practiced today. Another medical innovation spurred by the war was the development of blood banks. The need for blood transfusions on the battlefield led to the creation of organized blood donation and storage programs. The American Red Cross, for example, launched a national blood donation campaign during the war, establishing blood banks that would later serve as models for civilian hospitals. The concept of a blood bank, where blood could be collected, stored, and transported to those in need, became a vital component of modern healthcare systems worldwide. The war also led to advances in mental health care, as doctors and psychologists began to recognize the psychological toll of combat on soldiers. The condition we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was first understood in a more formal way during and after World War II. At the time, it was often referred to as combat fatigue or shell shock. Military psychiatrists developed early treatments for soldiers suffering from the trauma of warfare, laying the groundwork for modern psychological care for veterans and civilians alike. While there was still much to learn about the long-term effects of trauma, the war opened the door to more serious research into mental health and the treatment of psychological injuries. Beyond medicine and technology, World War II also spurred developments in communication and media. The war saw the widespread use of radio as a tool for both propaganda and real-time communication. For the first time, news of battles, speeches by world leaders, and updates from the front lines could be broadcast almost instantly to millions of people across the world. This helped to create a more informed and engaged global populace, a trend that would continue in the post-war era with the rise of television, and later the Internet. The war also led to the development of early forms of cryptography and secure communication systems, which would later evolve into the advanced communication technologies we rely on today. The scientific and technological advances made during World War II set the stage for the post-war boom in innovation. The expertise and discoveries that emerged from the war were soon applied to civilian life, fueling the rapid expansion of industries such as aviation, computing, medicine, and telecommunications. The creation of organizations like NASA and the exploration of space were direct results of wartime innovations in rocketry and aviation. Meanwhile, the digital revolution that would come to define the late 20th and early 21st centuries was rooted in the computing breakthroughs made during the war. While the war brought immense suffering, it also accelerated human progress in ways that would shape the modern world. The technologies, medical treatments, and communication systems developed during World War II continue to have a profound impact on how we live today, from the way we travel and communicate to the ways we heal and protect ourselves from disease. Chapter 6: The Cultural Shifts in Post-War Society. World War II not only transformed global politics and technology, but also profoundly reshaped the social and cultural fabric of nations around the world. The aftermath of the war set in motion sweeping changes that would redefine gender roles, civil rights, family structures, and even the way people thought about their own identities. In many ways, the war was a catalyst for a new world, a world where old hierarchies and norms were challenged, and new possibilities for equality and social justice began to emerge. One of the most significant cultural shifts after the war was the changing role of women. During the conflict, millions of women had taken on jobs and responsibilities that had traditionally been reserved for men. With so many men serving in the military, women stepped into the workforce in unprecedented numbers, working in factories, shipyards, and offices. In the United States, women who worked in defense industries were symbolized by the iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter, who represented strength and independence. In Britain, women took on roles in agriculture, engineering, and the civil defense services, while in the Soviet Union, women even served on the front lines as soldiers and pilots. Although many women were expected to return to their traditional roles as homemakers once the war ended, the experience of working and contributing to the war effort had left a lasting impact. For the first time, large numbers of women had proven their ability to work in traditionally male-dominated fields, and this newfound independence sparked a desire for greater equality. The post-war period saw the early seeds of the women's rights movement, as women began to demand better working conditions, equal pay, and the right to continue their careers outside the home. While full gender equality was still a long way off, the war had fundamentally altered perceptions of women's roles in society and laid the groundwork for the feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s. In the United States, the war also had a profound impact on the civil rights movement. The experiences of African American soldiers during the war, who fought for freedom abroad while facing discrimination at home, highlighted the deep racial inequalities in American society. Over 1 million African Americans served in the U.S. military during the war, and their contributions challenged the racist assumptions that had long been used to justify segregation and disenfranchisement. The Tuskegee Airmen, an all-black squadron of fighter pilots, became heroes for their bravery in combat, while African American soldiers serving in Europe experienced life in countries where segregation was not the norm. When these soldiers returned home, many were no longer willing to accept second-class citizenship. The war had emboldened African Americans to demand their rights, and the post-war years saw the rise of the civil rights movement. In 1948, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 99981, which desegregated the U.S. Armed Forces, marking a major victory for civil rights activists. The momentum for racial equality continued to build throughout the 1950s and 1960s, leading to landmark events such as the Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, and the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The fight for racial equality was far from over, but World War II had helped to ignite a movement that would transform American society. In Europe, the war also led to significant social and cultural changes. The physical and emotional scars of the conflict were felt deeply, and many Europeans were determined to rebuild not only their cities, but also their societies in ways that would prevent the horrors of war from recurring. In countries like Britain and France, the post-war period saw the rise of the welfare state, with governments taking on a greater role in providing health care, education, and social security to their citizens. In Britain, the creation of the National Health Service, NHS, in 1948 was a direct response to the hardships of the war, and marked the beginning of a new era of social welfare. The war also led to a reassessment of class structures in Europe. In Britain, for example, the shared experience of wartime suffering helped to break down some of the rigid class barriers that had long defined British society. The working classes, who had borne much of the brunt of the war effort, began to demand more rights and representation, leading to the election of the Labour Party in 1945 and the establishment of progressive social policies aimed at reducing inequality. Similarly, in France, the post-war period saw the emergence of new political movements that sought to address the inequalities that had contributed to the country's defeat in 1940. The cultural shifts of the post-war period were not limited to gender and class. In many countries, the war also led to changes in family structures and relationships. The devastation of the war had separated millions of families, and the process of reuniting and rebuilding homes after the conflict was often fraught with difficulty. Many women who had worked during the war found it challenging to return to their traditional domestic roles, leading to tensions in marriages and families. At the same time, the war had led to a significant increase in marriages and births, as couples sought to build new lives in the aftermath of the conflict. The post-war period became known as the baby boom, particularly in the United States, where millions of babies were born in the years following the war, creating a demographic shift that would have long-lasting effects on society. The war also had a significant impact on popular culture. The trauma of the conflict found expression in art, literature, and film, as writers, artists, and filmmakers grappled with the horrors they had witnessed. In Europe, the existentialist philosophy of thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus reflected a sense of disillusionment and questioning of traditional values in the wake of the war. At the same time, the rise of modernism in art and architecture, with its emphasis on simplicity and functionality, was a reaction to the destruction of the war and the desire to rebuild in a more rational and humane way. In the United States, the post-war years saw the rise of Hollywood as a global cultural powerhouse. The war had demonstrated the power of film as a medium for shaping public opinion, and in the years after the conflict, Hollywood produced a wave of films that reflected both the triumphs and the anxieties of the era. Films like Casablanca and It's a Wonderful Life became cultural touchstones, offering messages of hope and resilience in the face of hardship. At the same time, the film noir genre, with its dark and moody aesthetics, captured the sense of alienation and moral ambiguity that many felt in the wake of the war. Music also played a central role in the cultural shifts of the post-war period. In the United States, the rise of jazz and blues reflected the blending of cultures and the desire for freedom and expression. In Europe, classical music took on new forms, as composers like Benjamin Britten and Olivier Messiaen sought to address the themes of war, peace, and humanity in their work. The post-war period also saw the birth of rock and roll, a genre that would come to define the youth culture of the 1950s and 1960s, challenging the conventions of the older generation and giving voice to a new, rebellious spirit. The cultural shifts of the post-war world were wide-ranging and profound. The war had disrupted traditional social structures, and in its aftermath, people began to question the norms and values that had once seemed unshakable. In the years that followed, movements for civil rights, women's equality, and social justice gained momentum, reshaping societies around the world. At the same time, new forms of art, music, and literature emerged, reflecting the changing world and offering new ways of understanding and interpreting the human experience. Chapter 7. A World Transformed. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, the world had irrevocably changed. World War II had altered the course of history in ways that few could have imagined. It was a war that had spanned continents, devastated entire cities, and left an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of people across the globe. As the dust settled and nations began to rebuild, the far-reaching consequences of the war began to take shape, touching every aspect of life: political, economic, technological, and cultural. One of the most immediate and profound changes brought about by the war was the shift in the global balance of power. Before the conflict, Europe had been the center of world politics and economics, with empires that stretched across the globe. But the war had left Europe devastated. The once great imperial powers, such as Britain and France, emerged from the war weakened and indebted. Their cities had been bombed, their industries destroyed, and their populations exhausted. In their place, two new superpowers arose: the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States, largely untouched by the physical destruction of the war, emerged as the world's dominant economic and military power. With its industries booming and its infrastructure intact, the United States found itself in a unique position to shape the post-war world. American leadership was instrumental in the creation of institutions like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, which were designed to foster global cooperation and economic stability. At the same time, the Marshall Plan, through which the United States provided billions of dollars in aid to rebuild Western Europe, cemented America's role as a global leader and helped to contain the spread of communism. The Soviet Union, too, emerged from the war as a superpower. Although it had suffered enormous losses, more than 20 million Soviet citizens had died during the conflict, the Soviet Union had managed to drive back the Nazi invasion and capture vast territories in Eastern Europe. Under Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union established communist governments in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other countries, creating a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the capitalist West. This division of Europe into East and West would form the basis of the Cold War, a global ideological struggle that would dominate international relations for the next 45 years. The end of World War II also marked the beginning of a new era in international diplomacy. The creation of the United Nations in 1945 was a direct response to the failure of the League of Nations and the devastating consequences of the war. The United Nations was designed to provide a forum for nations to resolve their differences through dialogue rather than conflict. Its mission was not only to maintain international peace and security, but also to promote human rights, foster social and economic development, and provide humanitarian aid in times of crisis. The establishment of the Security Council, with its 5 permanent members, the United States, Soviet Union, China, France, and United Kingdom, reflected the new balance of power in the world and gave these nations the responsibility of maintaining global order. The war also accelerated the process of decolonization, as the imperial powers that had once controlled vast territories in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East found themselves unable to maintain their empires. The economic strain of the war, combined with the growing desire for independence among colonized peoples, led to the collapse of European colonial rule in the decades that followed. Countries like India, Pakistan, Ghana, and Algeria gained their independence, and the newly decolonized nations began to assert their place in the international community. The rise of the non-aligned movement, led by figures such as Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and Josip Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, reflected the desire of many nations to chart their own course, independent of the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of the war, the global economy underwent a dramatic transformation. The destruction of European industries and infrastructure had created an urgent need for rebuilding, and this need spurred economic growth in both Europe and the United States. The Bretton Woods Conference, held in 1944, laid the foundation for the post-war economic order, establishing the IMF and World Bank to stabilize currencies and provide financial support for reconstruction. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, signed in 1947, aimed to promote free trade and prevent the protectionist policies that had contributed to the Great Depression and the rise of fascism in the 1930s. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, provided more than $12 billion in aid to rebuild Western Europe, and by the early 1950s, the European economy was booming. At the same time, the United States experienced an unprecedented period of economic growth, driven by consumer demand, technological innovation, and government investment in infrastructure. The post-war economic boom helped to raise living standards in many parts of the world and set the stage for the rise of the middle class in countries like the United States, Britain, and Germany. The post-war period also saw significant advances in technology and science, many of which had their origins in wartime research. The development of the atomic bomb during the war had demonstrated the terrifying potential of nuclear energy, and in the years that followed, nuclear technology was harnessed for both military and civilian purposes. The space race between the United States and the Soviet Union, which began in the 1950s, was another direct result of wartime advances in rocketry and aviation. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 and the subsequent race to land a man on the moon were emblematic of the new era of technological competition that emerged in the post-war world. In the realm of medicine, the war had also spurred significant advances. The mass production of penicillin, the development of new surgical techniques, and the establishment of blood banks had all contributed to saving lives during the conflict. After the war, these innovations became standard practice in civilian medicine, leading to dramatic improvements in public health and life expectancy around the world. Culturally, the war had left a deep imprint on art, literature, and philosophy. The trauma of the conflict gave rise to new forms of expression, as artists and writers grappled with the horrors they had witnessed. In Europe, the existentialist movement, led by thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, reflected the disillusionment and alienation that many felt in the aftermath of the war. In the United States, the war had a profound influence on popular culture, from the rise of film noir to the emergence of rock and roll, as a new generation sought to break free from the conventions of the past. Perhaps most importantly, the war had brought about a new awareness of human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, was a direct response to the atrocities committed during the war, particularly the Holocaust. The Declaration set out a vision of a world in which all people were entitled to basic rights and freedoms, regardless of their race, religion, or nationality. This new emphasis on human rights would play a central role in the struggles for decolonization, civil rights, and gender equality in the decades that followed. In the end, World War II had left the world transformed. The political, economic, and social structures that had defined the pre-war world had been swept away, replaced by new institutions, new technologies, and new ways of thinking. The war had been a crucible of change, one that had reshaped the modern world in profound and lasting ways. As nations rebuilt and societies evolved, the legacy of World War II would continue to shape the course of history for generations to come.